Hello, everyone. We're back again with another episode of Policy Beats. We're joined here today with Mr. Adam. He is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. His research focuses on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is a veteran of the Marine Corps and the war in Afghanistan and received his JD from Temple University Beasley School of Law. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
How often have you visited Pakistan, and what has your experience been so far?
The first time I visited Pakistan was 2017, and I say on average, I visited 2 to 3 times per year. I try to visit 2 to 3 times per year. There's that brief period during COVID when it became impossible.
Right.
But I try to come to Pakistan as often as possible. So in the last 6 months, I've been here 3 times, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, Adam, do tell us, how did you find yourself working where you are today? I mean, you're a research fellow at Quincy and you've been working on the South Asian region. How did you end up taking the international relations field?
Well, it's really been kind of by accident, I guess. I studied international relations in college. Then I was a Marine and I served in Afghanistan. And I knew nothing about the region. In fact, I think if you had spoken to me at that time, you would have been like, wow, what an ignorant person. But I didn't know much, but that was my first exposure, was serving as a Marine. And then I went to law school and I worked for a little bit in Washington, D.C. That work was mostly related to legislative advocacy related to immigration rights.
Right.
But I always had an interest in the region. Then I worked in the private sector for KPMG on the international trade practice. But I just became very interested in Pakistan, actually, over time. And I attended a lot of conferences and worked on short-term consulting projects and eventually got into this field. And I guess what interested me about Pakistan was the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is just troubled enough to make it interesting.
Right.
But there's like light at the end of the tunnel. I think that things are improving between our two countries. I think there's lots of opportunities. I always feel welcome here. Relations are good enough that, I can come here and Pakistanis can come to the United States and we can have honest conversations. But there's still big problems to resolve, right? Which makes it interesting.
Right. Let me ask you then, as your experience as a Marine in Afghanistan, serving in Afghanistan, how did that experience pan out for you? And what sort of lessons did you draw from your time there in Afghanistan? And then, we saw the eventual withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan.
Yeah, when I went to Afghanistan, I think I had a maybe typical American mentality, which is that we're fundamentally a force for good in the world. And of course, the war in Afghanistan, as it's being fought, is completely justified. And look, it was not an unprovoked war. I understand why we entered Afghanistan. But as, a young 20-something in Afghanistan, I kind of felt like, what are we doing here? I remember just being on the side of a mountain and you're overlooking this valley that's really in the middle of nowhere in Kandahar and thinking, why are we here right now? It doesn't really make sense to be here right now. And all the resources that is being poured into this little valley in Kandahar that is a world away from the U.S. So that was my thinking at the time, which wasn't extremely nuanced, but that was my gut reaction. And I think it led me to start questioning some of the widely accepted ideas about U.S. foreign policy.
Interesting. And so coming to what's going on in Afghanistan today, we're seeing Taliban come to power. And often, mostly in Pakistan, of course, we tend to push the idea of a Taliban 2.0. But the United States of America has had that sort of agreement with the Taliban, which is why we're seeing them sort of be present in the country as well. I would like to know, how do you see what's the foreign policy with regards to Afghanistan when it comes to the U.S. right now? And when we're also seeing a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, we're seeing frozen assets at the same time. We don't want to engage with them in a level that we recognize them as the state elected by the people of Afghanistan, because that didn't happen. So how do you explain that?
Well, it's hard to explain, but I'll make an attempt. I mean, I think, let's say there's a stack of papers on the president's desk and files, let's say, and the Afghanistan file used to be near the top. And now it's really down at the bottom. President Biden didn't mention Afghanistan once in his State of the Union. And why would he? Because the country has moved on. And that's the cold, hard truth. I think the U.S. is still engaged with Afghanistan. There's still meetings that occur with the Taliban from time to time. There's still lines of communication. I think there's still a commitment to trying to improve human rights. There were many general licenses, which are essentially exceptions to sanctions, that were issued to try to help the Afghan people. It's true that the reserves remain frozen, the foreign exchange reserves. And initially, I was a big advocate of unfreezing them because I did think that the economy needed liquidity. And I said that many times. But I think the Taliban, unfortunately, have made that process impossible. And one thing, and due to their own actions, frankly, I mean, you can't be hosting the leader of Al-Qaeda in a house owned by the Minister of Interior. I mean, there's limits to these things. And they haven't really shown that they're going to assign competent people to the central bank. It is something that needs to be resolved over time. But it wouldn't be a silver bullet. Look, the foreign exchange reserves could be returned to the central bank tomorrow. All sanctions could be lifted, and we'd still be left with a landlocked, aid-dependent, poor country.
True.
So it's just, I think the way we talk about Afghanistan, we got really used to saying, we're going to reach this place in 2 years, this benchmark in 2 years. No, it's going to be measured in years and decades now, and there's going to have to be a lot of patience. And frankly, the importance of America to this region is going to be a little bit less, especially vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Like, Pakistan is probably more important to Afghanistan's future right now than the United States is. Same with all of Afghanistan's neighbors. Now, of course, what U.S. policy has an impact on what regional countries do, though.
Exactly. And so also just wanting to know a little, because there is the rising threat of ISKP, and we often hear the Chinese perspective that the ATIM might also gain ground in Afghanistan. So in terms of that, what do you see a potential U.S.-Afghanistan engagement to be looking like?
I think the top line priority for the United States in Afghanistan is counterterrorism, and I think the second priority is probably human rights, women's rights, and things like that. But the top line one is 100% terrorism. Although the main concern of the United States is transnational terrorist threats like Al-Qaeda. And TTP have been very careful to say we're only focused on Pakistan. They just released a statement like yesterday, I think, where they claim that they're not in Afghanistan, which is laughable. And then they claim that they're only focused on Pakistan. Who is that message for? I think that message is that, look, please, international community, ignore us. And Asfand Yarmir wrote an interesting journal article about how U.S. drone strikes had been had really affected the TTP in the past and terror groups in the past. And he's made this point too, which is that, look, the TTP is terrified of U.S. drone strikes, so they don't want to do anything that will bring the U.S. back into the region. And I'm not even suggesting that Pakistan would allow it, but hypothetically, they don't want that to happen. So and from the U.S. perspective, I think the U.S. is probably concerned about TTP and ISKP, especially ISKP, but so long as these groups are only doing things in Diyai Khan and Peshawar and places like that, unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be a huge priority for the U.S. But once there's a transnational element, that's when I think Washington
and that's
gets concerned.
essentially what they're avoiding, as you shared. Now, coming back to Pakistan-U.S. relations, since you also said there's an interest in that region, in that part of the discussion as well. So we tend to say that Pakistan-U.S. relations are at sort of an inflection point where we're still figuring out. But I would like to know that what are the key divergences currently in terms of our relations?
Thanks for asking this, because I wanted to clarify something I said earlier, which is I said I was interested in Pakistan initially because relations were just troubled enough to make things interesting.
Right.
I don't think troubled is the right word. I think that there's disagreements and there's big challenges we have to overcome. U.S.-Pakistan, the relationship between the United States and Pakistan is an important one. The United States was one of Pakistan's early supporters. I hate when people say we're frenemies. We've been friends for decades.
Right.
It's arguably Pakistan's most important relationship. Maybe China's its most important. We can debate about that, but it's definitely in the top two most important relationships for Pakistan. And Pakistan is important for the United States as well. But I think that for the last 20 years, it was held hostage by outcomes in Afghanistan, and both sides had unrealistic expectations of one another.
Right.
And both sides have failed to grapple with the mistakes that we've collectively made. And I feel immensely sorry for what's happened to the Afghan people. But the reality is, in terms of U.S.-Pakistan relations, the U.S. exit from Afghanistan presents an opportunity. We're no longer in a situation where, because something happened in Afghanistan, now we can't talk about something completely different in Pakistan. And so the relationship is going to become, I think, more focused in things like trade and, people-to-people exchanges. And there's still going to be a security element, but it's not going to be this front page news relationship. It's like I was saying outside a few minutes ago, some Pakistanis got upset that Pakistan wasn't listed in the national security strategy because they thought it meant it wasn't relevant. You don't want to be listed in the national security strategy. You just don't, especially if you're in this part of the world. It's actually a great thing not to be in the national security strategy of the United States. This is going to be an adjustment for Pakistanis, though, because I think Pakistanis have become accustomed to being on, the front page of news.
We're used to the attention, in other words.
Used to the attention. It's not necessarily good attention.
Yes.
U.S.-Pakistan relations are going to become maybe less interesting, but more productive and more useful. We're going to have to get into the weeds of what does trade actually look like? What does investment actually look like? How can we deal with some of the visa issues that exist between our two countries?
I feel like a lot of the exchange that has taken place between Pakistan and the US happens to be in our education sector. There's so many Pakistanis, even now the Fulbright is open and people want to, go study, understand, learn, and there's opportunity for exposure. But apart from that, when we speak of building a relationship with the U.S. from a different angle, resetting those relationships, that's for Pakistan, there's a concern, and that happens to be India, and whether or not the U.S. is engaging India for Pakistan. But we know that's not how it is because there's a greater U.S.-China competition happening. But for Pakistan, that causes a certain worry that if too much attention as we speak is going to India, the partnership is strengthening, that sort of creates, as many would say, a strategic stability problems for Pakistan and India. What do you have to say about that?
Look, I think a lot of people have said this, but I think Pakistan worries too much about India and needs to worry about Pakistan. What's going to make Pakistan great and achieve the greatness that it's capable of is resolving its economic problems. I mean,
Certainly.
This is the number one thing Pakistan could do. It's more important to national security and more important to the well-being of Pakistanis than any other issue.
Right.
And of course, probably climate change is a close second. I think Pakistani policymakers need to understand that the Indo-Pacific strategy is about a narrow set of security interests. And I think the relationship with India is more transactional than people often think. Yes, it is the style of U.S. diplomacy to shower things with shared values and civilizational things, and this is about a coalition of democracies.
Right.
But the reality is that many of these relations are quite transactional, and I think that
what is the transaction here, then, if I may?
well, it's in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's this great power competition with China, right? And I'm not necessarily endorsing that strategy, okay? I don't want this to be mistaken as me endorsing that. But that's what it's about. It's about, okay, there's U.S. competition with China, there's this issue of navies and things like this, and sort of collective defense. And I'm not an expert on the Indo-Pacific strategy or India, by the way, so I can't really go into depth on that. But that's what it's about. It's transactional. It's not. I often hear in Islamabad, oh, the U.S. prefers India. I don't think that's true. But India is a country of over 1 billion people. And it's a reality of the world. And of course, the United States is going to engage with India. This is not zero sum. Like there's enough engagement and opportunity for everyone. Right. And I think, the fixation on India is counterproductive. Sometimes I'll sit down with, and I mean this in the most respectful way possible, I'll sit down with a Pakistani diplomat or official, and I want to talk about, and I'm just to be clear, I don't represent the U.S. government, but I want to talk about something related to Pakistan or U.S.-Pakistan relations, and instead 10 minutes is spent like going back through, decades of history about India. Okay,
either India or Afghanistan, and I agree to it actually. Most of the Pakistani people would agree to this. The only problem I believe, or most of the problems generally arose from in the Pak-US relationship. Now, this is my personal understanding, is because the relationship was less people to people despite having that exchange. It was more sort of towards one elite group with another elite group interacting and forgetting how that would impact the grassroots level. And I will bring this up myself. You're here, you have your experience as an American citizen in Pakistan, but at the same time, in our media, you may often see a sort of sentiment of an anti-Americanism that was pretty much on the rise, at least last year. So essentially, I personally feel there needs to be a building up done on the grassroots level. Like engaging with people would probably benefit us more than figuring out whether or not the next move with India would impact Pakistan. I certainly agree to that. And so let's just move a little more towards the Middle East. I would like to know what is the U.S. foreign policy looking like for Middle East? We saw some ups and downs in terms of Saudi Arabia, the interaction that what do you have to say about that? And I think also recently China signed a Huawei deal with Saudi Arabia. There was this China Gulf Summit. How does that look like to the U.S., especially with the competition that's going on?
Well, look, our partners in the Middle East have their own partnerships, and I think it's always been an unrealistic expectation by Washington to think that just because we have close allies anywhere in the world, including the Middle East, that they're not going to engage with China. I think it's a wake-up call. Look, we do live in a multipolar world. I don't think China is trying to be a hegemon in the Middle East and kick America out. I think U.S. policy in the Middle East the Middle East has been deprioritized a little bit, but the U.S. still has a lot of engagement with the Middle East. This idea that we've just left the Middle East behind for China to take is absolutely preposterous. I do want to go back to something you said, though, about the people-to-people exchanges, because I think it's and the anti-Americanism, because I think it's often misunderstood, and it's an important point. Anti-Americanism in Pakistan it's conceptual. It's almost it does not get applied to the individual. I went to Imran Khan's Jalsa, and there were guys with signs that said, like, I won't be America's slave, or things like that. And yet they still wanted to take a photo with me. I still told them I was American. I didn't feel any concern. They shook my hand. They laughed. It's not expressed at the individual level. And of course, there's things like Islamophobia and stuff in the United States as well. The people-to-people exchanges are important, and there's not enough of them. There should be U.S. students who are studying Urdu in Pakistan. And I think the Pakistani government should probably push for that. And frankly, the U.S. State Department, it would benefit them as well. The United States, Pakistan provides more students that go to the United States on Fulbright than any other country.
Exactly.
But we should expand it to other people. I mean, I'm making a huge generalization because there's exceptions, but a lot of the Pakistani students who go to Fulbright come from backgrounds in which they already had a positive view of the United States. Why don't we have an exchange with Qadi-Azam? Why don't we have an exchange with other universities? And maybe short-term exchanges and academic conferences, and really
have professors come here, professors go there, exchange ideas.
Yeah, why aren't there programs? It doesn't always have to be through Fulbright. It doesn't always have to be a U.S. program. Why hasn't Pakistan created a program where a U.S. professor can, during their sabbatical, come to Pakistan for 1 year and
certainly.
teach? So there's really opportunities for exposure that both countries are missing, and I think that's important.
I think there needs to be a will that has to be pushed in these directions instead. And so I will just take concluding remarks from you on the U.S.-China competition and what sort of scenarios do you see play out in that, perhaps in the context of South Asia or in general. Where do you see that heading?
Well, it's interesting because the crisis that most afflicts South Asia, climate change, is one in which for there to be a resolution, the United States and China really need to work together. So I think there are these off-ramps from tensions in these issues where China and the United States can work together, or at least not work against one another, work in parallel. But I think this is a key distinction to make. There's a type of unhealthy great power competition that leads to conflict and puts the rest of the world caught in the middle. And then there's healthy competition in which, okay, maybe the United States and China are racing to develop the best green technology.
But that's the question. Will it be healthy?
I don't know. I think there's very strong forces in Beijing and Washington that don't want it to be healthy, that genuinely are so delusional that they think they can isolate and defeat the other. From a U.S. perspective, this idea that we can prevent the rise of China, this massive country, it was and is a great civilization. Of course, China aspires to be a world power. And I'm not naive about that. I don't think that China necessarily has the U.S. best interests in mind or even the world's best interests. I think China has its own interests in mind. And those sometimes are not necessarily something that's positive for the world, but sometimes it is. And I think what needs to be done is to really try to focus on areas where China can be positive.
Right.
And where there is opportunity to work with China. No, we're not going to be able to isolate and contain China. That's absolutely delusional. What we can do is work with China in some areas and compete with China in other areas. And I still believe in the U.S. model of development. I still believe, look, we helped vaccinate the world. The U.S. donated tens of millions of COVID vaccines to Pakistan. And if you were living in Pakistan, you definitely wanted an American vaccine. You didn't want the Chinese vaccine.
Well, we are living with both. We don't go for bloc politics.
That's true. But one was more effective than the other is the only point I'm making. There's things that the United States does well, and there's things that China does well. China does infrastructure quite well. And sometimes in Washington, folks will get upset. Oh, why are these countries accepting Chinese infrastructure? Well, because the United States hasn't offered an alternative. Do you expect them to do nothing? So those things can be frustrating. But I think going forward, what's going to need to be done is that Washington is going to have to say, okay, here are the areas we can work with China. Here are the areas we're going to compete with China. And here are the areas that we've decided not to do anything. So we shouldn't be surprised if China fills the void, such as the infrastructure example I just gave.
Thank you so much, Abden, for taking out the time for this podcast. It was an interesting discussion to have.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me.